Online-Veranstaltung heute Abend begrüßen und natürlich vor allem Michael Miller aus Wien von der Central European University. Er wird über die Frage sprechen, wer denn eigentlich die ersten Paneuropäer waren und welche Rolle Juden in oder auch gegenüber der Paneuropa-Union, die ja heute noch existiert, gespielt haben und was aus diesen paneuropäischen Träumen geworden ist, nicht zuletzt aber auch, was eigentlich die Gründer dieser Paneuropa-Union rund um Richard Nikolaus Coudenhove-Kalergi eigentlich motiviert hat zu diesem Unternehmen eines Europas ohne Grenzen oder wie wir vielleicht auch heute kritisch fragen werden, ob dies überhaupt ein Europa ganz ohne Grenzen gewesen ist und welche Grenzen die Gründer der Paneuropa-Union imaginiert haben. Michael Miller leitet an der Central European University heute vor allem in Wien, das Nationalismus-Studienprogramm. Er ist dort auch unterrichtend tätig im Programm für jüdische Studien und sein Forschungsschwerpunkt liegt nicht zuletzt auf der Wirkung der Nationalitätenkonflikte auf die religiöse, kulturelle und politische Entwicklung jüdischer Gemeinden in Osteuropa. Zurzeit arbeitet er unter anderem an der Geschichte der ungarischen Juden und schon 2011 erschien sein Buch über Rabbis and Revolution, The Jews of Moravia in the Age of Emancipation. Ich freue mich, dass du heute hier bist und the program will be in English. So I welcome also our English listeners to this program. I welcome Michael Miller from Vienna, from the Central European University, who will introduce us into the visions and motivations of the founders of the Paneuropa-Union, the Pan-European Union around Richard Nikolaus Coudenhove-Kalergi, and will tell us a bit of this about this very illustrious figure, being an aristocrat, a cosmopolite, and also a passionate fighter against anti-Semitism, and how this Pan-European Union came into being and what came out of their visions will be the subject of your presentation. I welcome Michael Miller, who is heading the Nationalism Studies program at the Central European University in Vienna and is also teaching there at the program for Jewish Studies. The center of his research is the impact of national conflicts on the religious, cultural, and political development of the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. And he's now working on a history of the Hungarian Jews. In 2011, his book appeared, Rabbis and Revolution, The Jews of Moravia in the Age of Emancipation. Welcome in Hohenems, Michael Miller, and the floor is open for you. Thanks for being here.
The ritual removing of the mask. Thank you, Hanno, Loewy, for the generous introduction and the generous invitation. And I'm very grateful that we have Zoom on an occasion like this. So it means that I can welcome friends and family and others from outside of Hohenems, from outside of Austria. So a pan-European crowd, actually a worldwide crowd. So thank you. It's also a very great honor to be in Hohenems. This is a small town that had a very significant Jewish community, especially in the 19th century, and it had a lot of parallels to some of the topics that I work on in areas further eastward. So it's actually, it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to start off by showing you an image. This is an image that some of you may be familiar with, and maybe not. You can identify it as a red cross, equilateral cross on a round yellow background. This is the cover of a book published in 1923 by Richard Nicolas Coudenhove-Kalergi, whose name you will hear a lot over the next 40 minutes or so. And he is really the founder and major proponent of the idea of Paneuropa, or the Pan-European Union, which I'll talk about much more extensively. The reason I'm showing you this image is because this seems to be a very Christian image. We're talking about Europe, which is being envisioned by Coudenhove-Kalergi, and he's chosen the Sonnenkreuz, or the Sun Cross, as the insignia for Paneuropa. And this is, again, a movement for the political, economic, and cultural unification of Europe, a movement that was established in Vienna in 1924, and to some extent is a precursor to the post-war European movement that led to the creation of the European Union. I'm going to read to you what Coudenhove-Kalergi had to say about this insignia. The Sun Cross, or the Sonnenkreuz, combines the two ancient symbols of European culture, Christian ethics and pagan beauty. And then he adds international humanity and modern enlightenment, heart and spirit, man or Mensch, and the cosmos. Under the banner of peace and freedom, the Pan-European crusade, Kreuzzug, against European self-annihilation will be fought until victory. So already in this, you can get a sense of what the Pan-European Union is going to stand for. But I want to point out that it's actually an interesting choice of an insignia. And he's comparing his movement to a crusade. He's using a cross. And the one thing I can say is that he probably did not have a Jewish audience in mind when he chose this symbol. Indeed, as the Viennese Zionists declared in October of 1926, we Jews have borne the cross of Europe for long enough. To him, red signified the blood of Jews killed in the First Crusade, in Speyer, Mainz, in Cologne, and yellow, the flames that burned Jews in Toledo and Sevilla in the Spanish Inquisition. And to his mind, those Jews who took up the Pan-European cross were only deceiving themselves, pretending to be native Europeans, bodenständige Europäer. I guess that's the best way to render that into English is, I think, is native Europeans, instead of what they actually were in his mind, nach dem Westen vorgeschobene Orientalen, Orientals who had migrated or advanced towards the West, only to suffer a never-ending onslaught of oppression and persecution. As a Zionist, he was more concerned about safeguarding a Jewish future in Palestine than in Europe. And he was more committed to realizing Theodor Herzl's Judenstaat than Coudenhove-Kalergi's Paneuropa. To him, Paneuropa was just the latest in a long line of ideologies that had enticed a certain class of Jews, as he refers to them, who yearned for assimilation at any price. And he was aware that many renowned Jewish artists, intellectuals, and politicians were drawn to the Pan-European idea and probably were not bothered by this insignia. And these Jewish artists, intellectuals, and politicians lent their prestige to Coudenhove-Kalergi's fledgling movement, and they actively participated in the first Pan-European Congress, which was held in Vienna in October 1926. There were two other congresses held before the Second World War, one in Basel, one in Berlin. But at the founding Congress in Vienna, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency was there. Okay, this is an event that is not a Jewish event per se, but the major wire service reporting on Jewish events reports on the first Pan-European Congress, a 4-day event, which it describes as the movement to establish a United States of Europe on the basis or on the model of the United States of America. And I'm going to quote a little bit from this article. Several Jewish European leaders took a prominent role in the first Pan-European Congress. And it points out that two of the principal speakers were Jewish. So the founder, of course, spoke, the head of the German parliament spoke, and so did Rudolf Goldscheid, a very famous Austrian sociologist and pacifist, and also Bronislaw Huberman, someone who is much more famous to musicologists than anybody else. He was one of the leading virtuoso violinists in the interwar period, eventually moved to Palestine and became involved in the Palestine Philharmonic, a predecessor to the Israel Philharmonic. So the article also pointed out that many of the backers of Pan-Europa were Jewish, the financial backers. And it also published the names of prominent European Jews who had sent greetings to the Congress. And the list was quite impressive. Names that you may have heard of, may not have heard of. Luigi Luzzati, I assume you have not heard of. Luigi Luzzati was actually a Jewish prime minister of Italy. Leon Blum, the French socialist leader. Georg Brandes, a Danish cultural critic. Georg Bernhard, a German journalist. Max Warburg, the German banker, and probably the one name that everybody here has heard of, Max Reinhardt, the world-famous Austrian theater director. And these are all people that were identified by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency as being Jewish. Not all of them would have identified as Jewish, at least as their primary identity. And to Coudenhove-Kalergi's great joy, 4 of Europe's most famous Jews also joined the Pan-European movement. Arthur Schnitzler, Stefan Zweig, Sigmund Freud, and Albert Einstein, someone that Coudenhove-Kalergi really wanted to become much more involved in the movement, probably one of the most famous people of the generation. Coudenhove-Kalergi found it natural, almost self-evident, that so many Jews sympathized with the Pan-European movement. Pan-Europa was one of the many plans for European unification that emerged after the horrors of the First World War, and its aim was to prevent Europe from descending into another, even deadlier conflagration, a war of annihilation, in his terms, a Vernichtungskrieg. In the next war, he predicted, the defeated nations will be annihilated, and the victorious nations will emerge out of this mass murder mortally wounded. This impending war will mean the downfall of Europe, its culture, and its economy. Other continents will take its place, which he meant primarily America and Asia. So for Coudenhove-Kalergi, I'm tempted to refer to him as CK. For him, Pan-Europa was above all a plan for Pax Europa. By creating a common European defensive union and a common European economic community rooted in common European values, the continent would enjoy economic prosperity and a cultural renaissance. This, in turn, would restore Europe's status as a world power, a Weltherrschaft, able to rival Asia and America, primarily economically, but also in other senses, and just as importantly, to cooperate with the 2 neighboring powers that were going to be excluded from the Pan-European Union, and these were Great Britain and Russia. So his vision, of course, after Brexit looks more prescient. The restoration of Europe's status also meant the victory of Enlightenment and humanism over chauvinism, chauvinismus. And this was a term that Coudenhove-Kalergi used obsessively. And this was a catch-all term to refer to aggressive, racist, and exclusionary nationalism, which often had anti-Semitic facets to it as well. And this was a nationalism that, if left unchecked, would turn Europe into, I quote, a mass grave and a rubble heap, the graveyard of a once flourishing culture. So again, there's some impressions here. He seemed to have seen a little bit what was coming. Coudenhove-Kalergi believed that Pan-Europa was good for the Jews. And he expected it to find particular support among the Jews of Europe in particular. In 1928, he elaborated on this matter in an interview with Die Wahrheit. Die Wahrheit meaning the truth. This was a Viennese Jewish weekly newspaper that sympathized with Pan-Europa and also was, I would say, a non-Zionist, not anti-Zionist, but a non-Zionist newspaper that was looking for integrationist strategies so that Jews and Christians could live together in Europe. In other words, it looked for the solution to the Jewish question in Europe, not outside of Europe. And in this article, he explained, the Jews have suffered so much in Europe, from religious and national fanaticism, from wars and revolution, that they must surely welcome an idea that is likely to bring peace, equal political rights, and economic security to Europe. From Coudenhove-Kalergi's perspective, the European question and the Jewish question were interlinked, intertwined, inseparable. And the solution to the former would naturally inform the solution to the latter. In his words, the European question is of such crucial importance to the Jews because more than half of the world's Jews live in Europe. Borders currently divide these millions of Jews from one another, and by dismantling these borders, European Jews will be unified. So it wasn't just a unification of Europe, it was also the unification of European Jewry. As we'll see, he sees this population as being, in fact, a kind of vanguard of Europeanness or pan-Europeanness and the most likely supporters of his movement. So for him, a unified Europe is a Europe without internal borders, something like Schengen today or Schengen before COVID, that would allow the continent's roughly 7 million Jews, this is not including the Jews of then the Soviet Union and Great Britain, and it would allow them to join together as a unified camp. Okay, so to work together and lobby and to come up with perhaps a European Jewish identity within the larger overarching European identity. Moreover, he saw their dispersion across all the lands of Europe as making the Jews perfectly suited for the European project, for the pan-European project. They could serve as a kind of spiritual or cultural vanguard, propagating the pan-European ideas across the continent in concert with European Christians. To some extent, this was a variation of the Jewish mission as formulated by Jewish reformers in the 19th century. Okay, so Jewish reformers, especially in the German lands, tried to re-understand the concept of chosenness, re-understand what the dispersion or the diaspora meant, and often giving these things a positive humanistic spin. So one of the classic Jewish reform explanations for the diaspora is that this is not punishment for the Jews' sins. This is not exile. This is actually dispersion so that the Jews can spread to the four corners of the world and spread something that in the 19th century was often referred to as ethical monotheism, so that they could spread a belief in a divine being that is enlightened and rational and good. But the variation, I would say, that Pan-Europa was propagating, or that Coudenhove-Kalergi, was that the Jews had been dispersed to the four corners of Europe in order to spread pan-Europeanism, that they were the heralds and the vanguards. Coudenhove-Kalergi was not the only one to characterize Pan-Europa as a fulfillment of the Jews' divine mission. Okay, so keep in mind that we'll hear a little bit more about Coudenhove-Kalergi, who was, as we'll see, he was descended from a Bohemian noble family on his father's side and a Japanese samurai family on his mother's side. So not exactly, didn't necessarily have a European pedigree on both sides. And I find it particularly interesting that the spokesman and founder of the pan-European idea is someone who himself was half Japanese. But Coudenhove-Kalergi's idea of this divine mission was echoed by one of the contributors to Die Wahrheit, someone whose name is F.J. Weiss. I like to imagine that his name was Franz Josef Weiss, but I have no idea what the F.J. actually stands for. He was a member of the Viennese Jewish community, and he emphasized that Pan-Europa and the Jews shared the same enemies. And these enemies were racial and national hatred. And Pan-Europa promised to overcome these sinister and destructive forces that had brought so much misfortune to humanity. And in Weiss's words, this would finally allow the Jews, quote, to breathe more freely after centuries of suffering and devote our full energy to fulfilling our divine mission, first and foremost, bringing about world peace. Der Verwirklichung der von Gott gesetzten heiligen Aufgaben, vor allem der Verwirklichung des Menschheitsfrieden zu wenden. We Jews are the oldest pacifists, he added. Pacifism is an integral part of our religion, which through the prophets has proclaimed the idea of world peace. Okay, so this is another important pillar of the pan-European idea, and this is anti-militarism and pacifism. And here's this idea that we're going to see is echoed by Coudenhove-Kalergi also, that the Jews are not only quintessential Europeans, as we're going to see, but they're also the first pacifists. And he writes in 1922, when before he's actually founded the movement, it is no coincidence that today so many great pacifists are Jews and so many great Jews are pacifists. There's a name that many of you may have heard of, and this is Alfred Freed. And I know that my mother and uncle, who are both Freeds, are out there right now. This is no relation of ours, but Alfred Freed was a pacifist during the First World War, Jewish, and in all of Coudenhove-Kalergi's writings, he mentions Alfred Freed, especially when talking about why this movement should be so appealing to Jews. So for Coudenhove-Kalergi, the prophetic tradition was important, but he also emphasized the historical circumstances that made Jews willy-nilly the vanguards of pacifism, disarmament, and anti-militarism. I quote, "The Jews were Europe's first nation to be disarmed." Okay, an interesting way to look at Jewish history. Jews were Europe's first nation to be disarmed, or first people to be disarmed. And this disarmament, he points out, was involuntary. And of course, he's going to be a proponent of voluntary disarmament. But in the end, this involuntary disarmament of the Jews proved to be a blessing in disguise. Unlike other peoples, Jews had been, quote, forced into a non-bellicose existence, which in turn allowed them to devote their time and energy not to matters of the body, but to matters of the spirit. And there's an interesting sort of inversion of the Christian anti-Jewish sentiment that Judaism is all about the flesh and Christianity is all about the spirit. And here Coudenhove-Kalergi is actually inverting this in some ways, that the Jews represent the spirit and Christianity represents the body or the flesh. The Jews, according to him, had become a Kulturvolk long before any of the Germanic peoples, and this, he believed, was the root of their pacifism. So a Kulturvolk that while the Germans or Germanic peoples were busy fighting, the Jews had developed the Bible and had developed a very high culture. And Jews, he pointed out, had also once been a bellicose people, but the Jews, because they were such an old cultural people or Kulturvolk, they had managed to get this out of their system. Okay, that they had the Maccabees, they had Bar Kokhba, they had a heroic tradition in biblical and post-biblical times, but this was unnecessary. They got it out of their system. And he says, and someday the Germans will learn from the Jews. Someday the Germans will get it out of their system, but because they are not an old Kulturfolk like the Jews, they're not as mature and they're still, busy fighting their childish battles. And he says, auch die Germanen werden einmal in der Zukunft Kriegsverächter sein. So even the Germans will get over their childish bellicose behavior, and they too will become like Jews. They will become pacifists or anti-war. But at this time, they were still too young, and they needed to transcend their warrior instincts, just as the Jews had done centuries before. The Jews were also, and I guess still are, a diasporic people, a very different kind of diasporic people in the 1920s. And as such, the Jews were a model for the supranationalism that lay at the heart of the Pan-European project. A lot of the literature in diaspora studies looks at the Jews as being the quintessential or paradigmatic diaspora, and this is used to look at them as a supranational people par excellence. And what Coudenhove-Kalergi writes about this is that the Jews have been rejected by narrow-minded nationalism. They've been rejected by the nationalism and national chauvinism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And this means that the best of them, and it's interesting, he says the best of them, this isn't all of the Jews, but the best of the Jews found their fatherland in the world. Okay, so they're cosmopolitans. And their patriotism in humanity. Then he goes on to say, the world mission of the Jews is to rebuild the destroyed world community through cosmopolitanism, pacifism, socialism. He doesn't mean communism here, he means a kind of a social democracy. Jews, he goes on to say, are the forerunners of a coming denationalized humanity. Vorläufer einer kommenden entnationalisierten Menschheit. Their goal is to love their fellow humans, not to hate them, to build up, not to tear down, to bind together, not to separate. In the spirit of the prophets, their goal is to lead humanity out of the Egyptian bondage of capitalism and militarism into the future promised land of freedom and peace. Okay, so again, we see the biblical narrative here being applied to the 20th century Pan-European project. Despite their nationalism, the Jews were also quintessentially European. Okay, I'm giving this lecture in the context of a museum exhibition here on the last Europeans, which is, when was the first one on the first Europeans? Okay, 2014. So this is why I'm giving this lecture tonight, because there is one exhibition now on the last Europeans, Jews as the last Europeans, and there was one 7 years ago on Jews as the first Europeans. So for Coudenhove-Kalergi, the Jews were quintessentially European, constituting what he calls a special branch of the European cultural community, einen besonderen Zweig der europäischen Kulturgemeinschaft. Coudenhove-Kalergi was the scion of a Bohemian noble family, as I mentioned, and a Japanese samurai family. And he was inclined, it seems, to think in terms of pedigree and caste. Not so much race, interestingly enough, but he was very concerned about caste and pedigree. To his mind, there were two great European castes. This is the term that he uses in German as well, Kasten. The aristocracy and the Jews. The former were a community of warriors and active heroes, and the latter, the Jews, were a community of martyrs and passive heroes. Okay, and those of you familiar with Hannah Arendt, she also looks at the sort of the parallel role of Jews in aristocracy in the 18th and 19th and early 20th centuries, and she draws a lot of comparisons. I assume that she was also influenced to some extent by Coudenhove-Kalergi's reflections on this. So they were separate castes, but not separate races, is what he points out. And again, he is very much opposed to any sort of anti-Semitism or racialist thinking. And he has his own version of European history, which is the mixing of Jews and Christians, which of course happened, but he places emphasis on this. And he talks about Jewish converts in the Middle Ages, and when he says when anti-Semitism was just religious, as opposed to racial or cultural, that anti-Semitism was just religious, which meant that you could leave one caste and go to another without there being a racial trail. So Jewish converts had married Christians often enough in the Middle Ages that all Europeans, he said, can count Jews among their forebears. There's a similar line of argumentation in Hungary in the late 19th century that all Hungarians can trace their ancestry back to the Jewish Khazars who came with the Hungarian tribes in the 9th century and conquered the Carpathian Basin. So that somehow the Jewish stock is somehow part of the Hungarian identity. And what he's arguing here is that Jewish stock is somehow part of the European identity. And in his view, it wasn't just Jews and Christians who were somehow inseparable in some ways. It was also Judaism and Christianity. And he's argued that they were so closely related that you could actually describe Judaism as a pre-Christian sect, or you could describe Christianity as a form of Reform Judaism. Of course, he didn't delve into the theological debates here. He acknowledged that there was tension between Judaism and Christianity, but he basically said that Judaism and Christianity had more in common than they had separating them. And he often liked to refer to a Jüdische Weltreich. And what is this Jewish world kingdom? It's the Jüdische Weltreich Christi. Okay, so for him, Christendom was actually a Jewish world dominion or a Jewish world kingdom. And as I said earlier, a lot of people, a lot of contemporaries pointed out, and this guy that I'm going to call Franz Josef Weiss, pointed out that Paneuropa and the Jews shared the same enemies. And not surprisingly, attacks on Paneuropa were rife with anti-Semitism. Coudenhove-Kalergi, as Hanno already mentioned, was one of the strongest proponents of what I would call anti-Semitism. And he wrote a number of works, and his father before him, an Austrian or Habsburg diplomat in Japan, also wrote a work on anti-Semitism and on opposing anti-Semitism. So there is a long pedigree of anti-Semitism in the Coudenhove-Kalergi family. And both of them, the father and son, were both attacked by anti-Semites for being Judenfreunde or for being Philo-Semites. So Paneuropa, not surprisingly, was attacked by the very forces that Coudenhove-Kalergi hoped that Paneuropa would overcome. In Germany and Hungary, the National Socialists and the awakening Magyars described and decried Paneuropa as high treason, Verrat, because it was predicated on the idea that Europe could be unified by peaceful means and not by force. And of course, Hungary and Germany, their foreign policy in this period was primarily directed at revising Trianon and Versailles. Okay, and the more conservative and right-wing and reactionary forces tended to choose or opt for force over peaceful means. Theodor Fritsch, author of the virulently anti-Semitic Handbuch der Judenfrage, the Handbook of the Jewish Question, considered pacifism in general as an unembellished Jewish matter. Sort of a nice German expression here, ungeschminkte jüdische Sache. This is what pacifism is in general, because peace movements fought against anti-Judaism, anti-Judaismus is the term that he actually uses here, and considered the defense of Jewry to be their first priority. Okay, so from this perspective, pacifism in general was a tool of the Jews meant to convince the world to defend their interests before everybody else's, that they were the ones who had the most to lose from war, which is why they were pacifists. So it's also a variation on the argument that Coudenhove-Kalergi is making, but it's an anti-Semitic variation on that. Paneuropa, wrote Theodor Fritsch, openly proposes the dream of Jewish world domination. So here again is this Weltherrschaft, the term that appears over and over again in the Paneuropa writings, but also in the anti-Paneuropa writings. He goes on to write, the man of the distant future will be a Mischling. And of course, he has Coudenhove-Kalergi in mind, who himself is a Mischling. Paneuropa will be inhabited by a Eurasian Negroid race of the future. The Jews, a new noble race of the spirit of grace, will constitute the leader people, Führervolk, of the future. Okay, so again, it's very clear that this is viewed by Theodor Fritsch as something that is competing with Aryan visions of world domination, that this is a Jewish alternative to that. And he's also using this idea of the Führervolk, which is a term that is often used in Nazi parlance to describe the role of the Germans or the Aryans. Of course, Hitler also was anti-Paneuropa, which is not surprising. He claimed that Jews welcomed Paneuropa in particular because it leads to racial chaos and confusion, which would serve their advantages. I could cite a dozen or probably a couple of hundred other sources, anti-Semitic sources, anti-Freemasonry sources, and they all characterize Paneuropa as a Judeo-Masonic plot to mix the races, seize world power, or undermine Germany's position in Europe. But these sources are not particularly interesting, and they're not particularly surprising. So what I want to do now is I want to actually end with a surprising set of sources, and these are opposition to Paneuropa, not from the reactionary anti-Semites, but opposition to Paneuropa on the part of many Zionists. Like the one I quoted at the very beginning of this talk, who expressed concern about this symbol. Again, remember, the red is the blood of the Jews killed in the Crusades. The yellow is the flames of the Jews killed in the Inquisition. And of course, there were Zionists who were not opposed to Paneuropa, and there were cultural Zionists, spiritual Zionists who actually were quite sympathetic to Paneuropa, and they even saw it as a way to maybe secure Jewish national rights on a European scale, to develop some sort of Jewish culture in the diaspora. Others, however, were taken aback by Coudenhove-Kalergi's opposition to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And this shouldn't be surprising. You know, Coudenhove-Kalergi was not opposed to nationalism. He was opposed to what he called national chauvinism. But his opposition to Zionism was not because it was a national movement. He actually saw the Pan-European-Union as a way to bring together national movements. So you didn't have to denounce your own or reject your own national identity. This was actually a way of bringing it to a state of more flourishing. But he was opposed to, not to Zionism per se, but the establishment of a Jewish state. So opposed to Herzlian political Zionism. And it was in large part because the establishment of a state would in very many respects force these Jews to lose sight of their actual divine mission, to bring peace to the world. And if they descended into nationalism and became like all other nations, which is the goal of Zionism, this would not happen. They would lose their divine calling. They would not be able to fulfill their mission. So it's interesting, this is a supporter of Jewish rights, and in the diaspora, he actually supports Jewish national rights. But he doesn't think that these national rights should lead to the establishment of a state. And I'm going to quote from his views on Zionism, published in 1927. The Jews' mission is not to establish a small Asian republic and add a new nationalism to the many existing nationalisms, but rather to become the social conscience of European culture based on their great tradition, suspense, okay. Based on their great tradition that leads from Moses and the prophets through Christ and Spinoza to modern socialism. Okay, so you can see his worldview here as well. Of course, after the Nazis came to power in 1933, and the Nazis, by the way, banned the Paneuropa movement in Germany in 1933, in Austria in 1938. Coudenhove-Kalergi recognized the urgency of getting Jews out of Europe, at least those who could not fully assimilate into the majority population. Okay, and in 1937, when he writes what I'm about to read, this is before anybody knows what's happening. We know what's happening in Germany between 1933 and 1937. This is before Kristallnacht. This is before the Anschluss. There is still hope in his eyes that the Jews of Western Europe, at least, could fully assimilate. And that Paneuropa would maybe even help with this. But the Jews of Eastern Europe were hopeless in his ideas. They couldn't actually fully assimilate. The Jews of Central Europe, you know, this is the crossroads, and he thought the Jews of the eastern parts of Central Europe would not be able to assimilate, but Jews in the western parts, so those in Hohenems presumably, would be able to fully assimilate, many of those in Vienna as well. So Zionism, of course, which aimed to establish a Jewish majority in Palestine, at least the form of Zionism that he is concerned about, was not a viable option in 1937. It was not a viable option because of another pan ideology. I haven't talked extensively about his whole worldview, but he's concerned about pan-Asianism, and he's also, of course, concerned about pan-Arabism. And he recognizes that in 1937, the Jews of Europe can't be transported en masse to British Mandatory Palestine because there is so much resistance from the pan-Arab movement. So he proposed a solution that may sound surprising at first. It was surprising to me, certainly. And this was a solution that is especially surprising for someone who sees himself as an enlightened apostle of peace. And his solution was the mass migration of Jews, Eastern European Jews in particular, to Rhodesia. Rhodesia, which was then under British colonial rule. And to understand why he proposed this, another thing about Coudenhove-Kalergi's Paneuropa that I didn't mention is that his Paneuropa was not just the continent, excluding, of course, Great Britain and Russia. It was also all of the African colonies belonging to these European countries, and also the former German colonies in Africa. So when he proposes to move the Jews of Europe to Rhodesia, he sees this as part of his larger Pan-Europa vision. And to his mind, first of all, the colonies were the only way that Europe could remain economically competitive on a global scale. And in Rhodesia, where there were, according to his calculations, 2.5 million blacks and 70,000 whites in 1937, the European Jews would fulfill a very different kind of mission than he was describing before. And let me quote Coudenhove-Kalergi's own words from 1937. In regions where the white race can be saved in the long term through settlement activity, a large-scale Jewish settlement could be of decisive importance for the future of white mankind. Because of this small Jewish state, which he refers to in German as Judenstaat, so Herzl's term also, because the small Jewish state could establish, in cooperation with the British Empire, a condominium in Africa, so this is a legal arrangement, that would be capable of opening an expansive territory of settlement for the Jews of Eastern Europe under their own flag. So it's not clear how this would be a fulfillment of the Jews' divine mission to bring world peace. Maybe you have some reflections on this. Coudenhove-Kalergi often wrote about something he called pacifist imperialism. Maybe this is what he has in mind. I understand pacifist imperialism as probably what Rudyard Kipling understood as the white man's burden, or what we know in France as the mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. And perhaps this was an attempt to export the social conscience of European culture to Africa. Or perhaps it was simply a recognition that the ideals of pacifism and humanism had been defeated in Europe, and maybe that the Jews were, in fact, the last Europeans.
Thank you so much for your talk and the indeed surprising curve in the end that was my first impression, brought the pan-European pacifist idea into the cosmos of colonialism, and in a very paradoxical way, maybe build a bridge into a present that the state of political humanity envisioned in Southern Africa, but exactly where people it wouldn't be possible, but still in a maybe colonial position. As a kind of a European fortress installed rule into another part of the world. At least politically, in a very paradoxical way.
Well, I find, there's a lot of things I find surprising about this proposal from 1937. And one of them is that this is a forceful defense of what he calls vice, maybe, I forget the actual term, but what I translate here is white mankind or white mankind. And he's using racial terminology that we expect to find in the mouths of his anti-European opponents, his racial anti-Semites, his National Socialist thinkers. But he's talking about a white humankind or white mankind needs to be saved. And I'm not sure if this is using the same racial considerations that are taking place in Europe right now, but it's possible that for him, white humankind is synonymous with Europeans. And that this is somehow the culture of the white world. He's thinking in terms of Pan-Europe, Paneuropa, Pan-Asia, Pan-Africa, Pan-Arab world, and all these kind of ideologies that I think in his mind are actually identified to some extent racially. But it's really surprising coming from someone who himself is half Japanese and half European.
The first question that came to me, the first one,
looking at the fate of the Pan-European Union that was banned by the Nazis, Germany and Austria, that popped up later, in a development that led to a healthy unified Europe, under the auspices of the divided world, which made it easier or more difficult to unify Europe. The Pan-European Union didn't play so much prominent role after 45 as one could think of, given the program of the 20s that political developments of the 50s and the 60s. And it's still existing. What became of that movement? I mean, today it's not talking about socialism. It's a more very conservative movement. Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is that the only time the Pan-European Union really, I think, had an impact in the last couple of decades was with the Pan-European. Right, this was on the Austro-Hungarian border, and Otto von Habsburg orbited.
I think at that point he was also, I forget if he was the leader of the movement at that point. He organized the Pan-European picnic on the Austro-Hungarian border, which in some respects, I don't know if it led to, but it preceded the downfall of communism and the bridging of East and West. Right? So this is the one time when the Pan-European Union was really in the news and may have actually played a historical role, at least in the post-World War II period. And I don't know that much about today's Pan-European Union, except that Christianity is much more of a pillar. And as you can see in what I read so far, Christianity was a pillar of Coudenhove-Kalergi's Pan-Europa, but for him, Christianity was socialism. For him, Christ was a socialist prophet. And in something I didn't quote from, he talks about the two great Jews who have contributed to this movement of socialism. And this is Karl Marx and Jesus Christ. Okay, so his Christianity was very different. I think now the Pan-Europa movement is, I mean, again, it's no surprise that Otto von Habsburg was very involved in this movement. It became a much more conservative, much more Christian movement, I think, with nostalgia for an old Europe, and I think an old Habsburg Europe. And to some extent, the Pan-European Union avant la lettre was the Habsburg Empire. So part of this larger Habsburg nostalgia with the last heir to the crown being the head of this, or the symbolic head. So what was seen as something, I mean, for Coudenhove-Kalergi, this was something that came after the fall of the Habsburg Empire. And I think after the Second World War and of course, the Vernichtungskrieg that was predicted by Coudenhove-Kalergi, then there was this kind of nostalgia for not what came before the Second World War, but what came before the First World War, and that the Habsburg Empire was somehow a form of a Pan-European Union.
Yeah, I mean, if you look into the agenda of the Pan-European today and the last decades, the reunification of Western Europe with Eastern Europe and the liberation, in their words, of Eastern Europe away from communism and socialism, basically, was one of the main goals. It is still, in a way, the main subject of their publications even and their conferences.
And there is continuity, because although Coudenhove-Kalergi was a ardent socialist or social democrat, he was a virulent anti-communist. So one of the reasons that he was concerned about Russia was not only because it was potentially an economic powerhouse that would, economic and military powerhouse that would threaten Europe, but also because of Bolshevism, right? And this, I think, is a continuity between the Pan-Europa of the 1920s and the Pan-Europa of certainly of the 1970s and 80s, and also to some extent today.
I mean, if you look into the political map today and the talking about Christianity and Judaism, the Pan-European Union has definitely fell back to the cross in a way, but there's a lot of talking about Christian, Jewish, Abendland and values and things like that, but they come from a different kind of camp, because now this parole comes more from the nationalist camp, and it definitely does include Judaism as a word, but it does not include Judaism as a part of Europe, but more or less as part of a past and a territory somewhere else, banned into Asia.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's also interesting here is that the Judeo-Christian tradition, I mean, Kornhofer-Kalergi doesn't actually use this expression, which is, I think, coined, I forget when this is coined actually, I think it's coined really in the 1930s or 1940s. He doesn't use this expression, but he's using this Judeo-Christian tradition to basically signify a religiously inspired socialism. And the enemy here is Bolshevism. The enemy here is what he calls chauvinism of all forms. And I think the Judeo-Christian tradition, again, I don't know enough about how this is used in the Pan-European Union today, so I'm going to speak more generally, that often the Judeo-Christian tradition is a slogan that is used by neocons, and the enemy is not necessarily Bolshevism, the enemy is Islam, right? So the Judeo-Christian tradition as the tradition of the Abendland, of the Occident, the
Occident.
Yeah, the Occident. Yeah. All right, Morgenland is the Orient. Yeah. So this is what distinguishes the enlightened, cultured West from what is described here more or less as a barbarian, uncivilized East. Right? And that is the dividing line here. And the dividing line was very different in Kornhofer-Kalergi's writings.
Now the question is, if reading these dreams of the Pan-European thinkers is more than Kornhofer-Kalergi. I mean, who else was expressing not just support for it, but were other involved in developing ideas, visions, programs?
There were other competing programs in this period. First of all, the Pan-Europa movement, or the Pan-European Union, to a large extent, was a one-man show. That Pan-Europa referred to movement, the union, a publishing house, a journal, and Kornhofer-Kalergi was involved in all of these. And this was basically a way to showcase his ideas. And it was very important for him to bring on board intellectuals and artists of the period. So the list that I read in the beginning of the Jewish intellectuals and artists, these were very important for him. And there's a wonderful letter that he wrote to Einstein. And I believe this is so the first Pan-Europa Congress was in Vienna in 1926, and there was another one planned for Brussels in 1928, which never happened. And in 1927, he wrote Einstein and asked him to speak at the Brussels Pan-Europa Congress. And Einstein basically said, you know what, I agree with everything you said. I have nothing else to add. All I should say is that we should really be concerned about unifying the European unification movements, because there were too many in his mind, too many competing movements. Pan-Europa was the most prominent of them, and there were other ones that were less prominent. And again, there were these, we would call them today, celebrity endorsements were very important to Kornhofer-Kalergi. To what extent these people were actually ardent supporters It's another question, but he wanted Zweig and Schnitzler and all these others to lend their names and prestige to this movement. Probably the one other person who was very much identified with this movement was Bronislaw Huberman. The name that I mentioned earlier, I'm sure that nobody out there has heard of Bronislaw Huberman except maybe the musicologists and music fans. He wrote a book in the 1920s called Mein Weg zur Paneuropa, and all about how he became a Pan-European. He was a Polish Jew, originally from Habsburg Galicia, but then the independent Republic of Poland. And he doesn't really talk about his Jewishness as being part of this, interestingly enough. But Bronislaw Huberman, who ended up in Tel Aviv, was one of the most prominent proponents of Pan-Europa in this period.
And when it was different, it was definitely not only a one-man show, but it was a man show, because I never got into significant women who contributed to that. While there were other Pan-European movements, not naming themselves like that, that were led by women. I mean, Louise Weiss, French lady, she published a Pan-European review, a paper with a lot of contributions from particularly France and Germany. She got lost in oblivion for many, many years, only to pop up in the end of her life to become the eldest of the European Parliament, the first one to be elected European-wide. And she's now naming, after she died, naming the building of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, but nobody knows anything about her, while she was really involved in discussing matters with a lot of people, not just as a one-woman show. So there were many around. And the Pan-European movement maybe is so famous because they made to pop up after 45 again with a hot issue that was reunification of Europe and fighting back the Russians from Eastern Europe. So that made them famous after they already died in a way. But I think it's interesting to look into the plurality of European movements of the 20s, and not only the one that survived in memory, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's a sort of a blurry line separating the Pan-European movements and the pacifist movements. And the fact, let's say Bronislaw Huberman, who I mentioned, was seen as a pacifist. Alfred Freed, who I mentioned earlier, was a pacifist. And as a pacifist, he was seen as a forerunner to the European Union. So there is a proliferation of pacifist movements, of European movements. And I think what's interesting is that some of them actually only limit themselves to Europe. Right? That's actually what's more interesting, is that all the Pan-European movements in this period that are defining themselves as Pan-European, I mean, I guess to some extent, National Socialism is Pan-European or becomes Pan-European, but the self-defined Pan-European movements limit themselves to Europe, but they share a lot in common with the other pacifist movements. And I think the interesting question is, why only limit themselves to Europe and not actually transcend those boundaries? And it's interesting how they also define Europe. That, to what extent does Europe include the United Kingdom? I mean, Europe never includes the Soviet Union, but there are parts of Europe that are occupied by the Soviet Union. And what I find most interesting is that Europe, at least in this definition, includes the colonial empires. And for me, that's the most striking thing, is that these are movements defined as Pan-European, but they have colonies primarily in Africa that are attached to them. So this pacifist, humanistic movement doesn't really seem to have a problem with colonialism.
No, and I think the aftermath of that deficit is the energy of the really important debates of today, in a way. It's interesting to read the personal reasonings of one of the supporters of Code Novo Kalergi, Stefan Zweig, that were just published recently, his letters concerning his personal relationship to Judaism. And during World War I, he had a lengthy exchange of letters with Martin Buber, in which he always calls Buber's and his friends "you nationalists." You nationalists. And Buber was a cultural Zionist with an idea of also a pan-Jewish Palestinian or Arab kind of peaceful coexistence in Palestine. But he always calls him "you nationalists." And Stefan Zweig, again and again in his letters to Buber, and he seems to he's appealing to Buber as the Jewish authority of his times, the one who understood the Bible. And he appeals to him and tries to explain his way of thinking. And he explains why he could become a Zionist, because that would mean that now we Jews also start with flags and cannons and nationalism, et cetera, and the result will be that we will be a caricature of those who are after us. And in the end, it will only divide, it will banalize Judaism, and it will divide Judaism. That's what it will divide us in the end. But was there any open discourse between, Jewish thinkers like Stefan Zweig, who was really discussing very openly these burning issues with Jewish compatriots like Buber? But did Coudenhove-Kalergi ever discuss things like that with people like Stefan Zweig and others? Are there exchanges of letters in which they really talk openly about these things?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I find, I mentioned the Einstein letter, where they don't actually talk about content. They talk about the role that Einstein is potentially going to play in the movement. I would it's something I need to look into, but I would assume that there are some letters. The collection is, or the Nachlass is at the European University Institute in Florence. And it's something that I'll have to look into in more detail. It's one of the, there's so many archives that are available online now, and this is one that is not available online. But what strikes me about your comments about Zweig is that this is exactly Coudenhove-Kalergi's argument, that essentially a political Zionist project will deprive the Jews of what makes them special. That this effort to become a nation like all the nations will force them to shed their special mission, their special role, right? And Coudenhove-Kalergi also talks about this division between East and West. He's not, of course, the first one to come up with the division between Eastern European Jews and Western European Jews, or to propose separate solutions for the Eastern European Jewish problem and the Western European Jewish problem. And interestingly, he proposes a solution that's similar to Herzl's, right? Which is like, okay, we know that most of the Western European Jews are just going to fully assimilate, and we need to worry about the Eastern European Jews because they're helpless or hopeless. So Zionism for Herzl is about solving partly the Western European problem of assimilation, and it's the Eastern European problem of this is a group that still has some sort of national characters, and they're never going to assimilate in Eastern Europe, so they need to be taken en masse to Palestine or maybe Argentina or Rhodesia, or Uganda at some point. But so here for Coudenhove-Kalergi, and it's the solution is needed for Eastern European Jews. He expects Western European Jews to fully assimilate. But again, we see this perpetuation of this division between East and West, and that somehow Zionism is going to divide the Jews. It's not going to provide any sort of unification. And I think he sees his European or pan-European project as actually a way of bringing together all of these Jews and creating a a pan-European culture, but having a place for different national identities and different kinds of patriotism within that. So an allegiance to a supranational entity, but also somehow an allegiance to a national entity. And Jews in Poland and in Germany and in Sweden can somehow all identify as Europeans, right, or European Jews. And this is something that I think is at the heart of Coudenhove-Kalergi's thinking on the Jews of Europe.
I mean, in any case, in the 1930s, there was less reason for optimistic visions for Europe and the Jews and the world at all. So, I mean, people try to be realistic, even if this realism might have been part of the problem itself. Thank you very much for this intriguing talk and the lecture. It will be also preserved and could be listened to later. Thanks for our audience online. And next week, we'll have a talk with Brian Kluck in London. Unfortunately, he can't be present because he's not able to travel in Austria. He would have to fly in from London, and things are still a little more delicate there. So our talk with Brian will be only online. And on June 8, we will have a talk with Nathan Schneider, also online, connected with Tel Aviv. So thanks a lot for coming. And I think there's a lot of open threads still to follow into this history of the idea of Europe. I think there's still a lot of surprises waiting for us in the archives, I think. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.